Hello there. My name is Frankie Debo and I was born in 1969. 53 years ago, back in a time, my parents Lillian and Willie were to teenagers and were in love together for a short time for 3 years. After 3 years in relationship, decided Lillian and Willie to married. On the 1 Street, September 1967, married Lillian and Willie for the church. There were a lot of people invited at our ceremony on that day. Lillian and Willie both had work in the city of Aldenard. My father worked in the green department, and my mother worked as a cleaning lady. They had a rented house in the Dienststraat where they lived. My parents went to work every day. They didn't have much. They saved up for a car and a TV to watch. They had a small garden to grow vegetables and potatoes, but not much came of it. My dad had been drinking for a few years before the relationship. My mother came from a family of 6 children, and so did my father. Every day my father came home drunk and my mother only came home around 8 p.m. Things didn't go well after a week when they were married. There was always a lot of fighting and drinking problems because of my father. My mother wanted to divorce my father. Roger and Simon were Lillian's parents and did not want them to divorce. At the time, this was an embarrassment to the family and works talked about them. Now my mother speaks to my father and says I am going to divorce you. You knock on me. You come home drunk every day and I don't want this.
Yes, I want a divorce. But I'm not doing it for my parents. Otherwise my parents will be watched by the whole village and I don't want that. I'm sorry I married you. I want a better life. I don't want to live who goes to a bar after working hours and comes home drunk every day. I imagined it differently.
What have I seen in you? You have been in a relationship with me for 3 years, and you never said anything good about me. I'm devastated. Too bad for my parents and myself.
My mother worked hard all days and weeks and months. But my father continued to drink and make a fuss. My father spent more time in the cafes than at home with his wife. But he didn't really care. He had more fun in the cafes than helping my mother. It was very long days and months. The landlady of their cottage asked them that they had 14 days to look for something else. So my father neglected the house. My mother was very sad. My mother's sister lived in the same street as my mother and father and her parents. After finding another house, my mother and father lived on the opposite side of the street from their previous one. My mother changes jobs and started cleaning in the school. She started working from 4 p.m. every day except Saturdays and Sundays. My mom prepared dinner for my dad. She had found a new friend and they called them Gabby and Murray Jose. She took care of the children and sometimes they came to visit my mother. My mother then had a TV and a stereo system. She listened to music a lot. Back then it was all rock and roll. My father drank every day and was always late, and when he came home for dinner he threw the food on the wall that my mother had prepared. My father then went upstairs to sleep off his rust, and when it was evening he went back to drink into the night. He has hardly ever been ill. He couldn't master himself, and when he was over he couldn't count to words. Then it was peace itself. But when he started drinking again it was a beast, and my mother was afraid of it. At that time there were no gynecology. Her doctor told my mother not to have children because my father was really a drunk. The doctor said, "It is best not to be intimacy with each other and be careful not to get pregnant, because all that alcohol in his blood will put it on that child, and that is certainly not good and not recommended." That made my mom worry. But my dad obliged and forced her to be intimate in a very unwanted, brutal way. More rape. My mother told her friends that she didn't want children of her own, and that she certainly wouldn't start with a man like my father. She had the fright of her life. Let's just hope I'm not pregnant, because I don't want that at all. I'm not for kids. But the suffering kept coming and going. And my father had fun in the cafes with other women. When he came home every time after that, he threw everything short and small and to pieces and threw it on my mom and stomped on her belly.
My mom was all upset when she learned she was pregnant by someone else that my dad said when he was in a drunken stupor. My mother absolutely did not want that child. You can't raise a child with a father like that. And isn't it good for that child if the father really isn't there for that child? My mother was crying and didn't know what to do with her. She thought to herself, if I had a miscarriage, I would feel much happier than I do now. Then my mother went to the doctor, and the doctor said that she should keep the child and not have an abortion. Whatever the situation was for her.
My mother went to the doctor because she couldn't keep me. She had a miscarriage, but her doctor gave her hope and medication to bring her child into the world. She was 6 months pregnant when this happened. After all that disaster and misery and apart from my father, she had given up hope. She couldn't find a future with my father and couldn't stand what he did to her anymore. She was so petite and pale and had heart palpitations and anxiety because of my father. He wouldn't listen to her and do his thinking and just keep drinking and having fun while my mom was all on her own. She got no help from my father. My mother was broken and humiliated and berated by my father. He was no longer human, but a real beast. 6 months on.
Lillian is going to give birth today. We are September 17 at 9 p.m. at night. My mom is suffering in the delivery room. She asks the midwife how long it will take. She makes them out of killers. She says she's going to hang her. That she is in so much pain. It's not time to give birth yet, says the midwife. When it's time, we'll raise it. She says to Lillian, Willie is also there but distances herself from everything. Here's a pint of beer and it hands back. We are now already September 18, 1969. After hours of waiting and suffering, the doctor finally starts the delivery. I came into the world at 8:40 in the morning with a caesarean section.
Frankie! My mother and my father gave me the name Frankie. My mom had to stay in hospital for another 14 days. I was awake at 4 o'clock in the morning to get a bottle of porridge. My dad had gone home to sleep. The next day my father went to pick up 2 random people to go to the administrator's centre for the birth of their child. I was given the name Frankie Debo. My mother will be in hospital for 14 days. Today she was allowed to go home with me. My father picked us up and drove to their cottage. There was my cradle and above my little nursery. My mother always has to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to give a bottle of milk and a porridge. My father was not pleased that he was always awake because of my crying. It took a few months. My father never looked at me. All the work was for my mother. She didn't have it easy. She also went to work and my father was still drinking. 3 years later, I went to primary school in Bever for the first time to the first colouring class. We were then January 1973. I could take steps and I could already walk quite well. As far as my health is concerned, things were going very well until then. My mother and father went out to work and my grandmother and grandfather came for me to continue at their house until my parents came after me. My father gave me many beatings and I went to bed without food while he was always drunk. As a 3-year-old child, I was always afraid of my father. One day he himself smashed a bottle of milk on my forehead, and I had to go to the hospital. It was not an easy time for my mother. Well, her parents took care of me. Over the years, I was hospitalized several times. My health was not good as a 4- and 5-year-old child. I didn't go to school much because I spent a lot of time in the hospital. I was thin and didn't weigh much. The months passed. 1 year later, I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, me and my parents occasionally went to the sea in Holland, namely Catsand and Sluis. We also went to amusement parks and such like Bellewaerde and Wallaby. I went with my grandmother by train to the sea to Ostend and Bruges. But as a 6-year-old child, I already had problems with fears and with people, and I sometimes had heart problems. That my heart was beating irregularly. I went to do my first communion in 1975 in April. 2 years later, I was 8 years old. One day I went to sleep and it was on TV Game Without Limits and it was 20 o'clock. I was sleeping and suddenly I felt something flow up on the side of my heart. It was like water being sucked up on the left side of my heart. The next day when I got up I didn't feel well and I was so pale and my lips were brown. I told my mom I'm not going to school today. My father didn't believe me and he made me go to school. My mother called the pediatrician that we could come. We went to the pediatrician at 11 o'clock in the afternoon. The pediatrician examined me but could not make a diagnosis. Everything was fine according to him. I told him there was water running and he said I'll listen with a stethoscope and he determined something wasn't right. He said he was going to take an X-ray and it showed that I was very ill and that I had to go to the hospital immediately. Are you on foot or by car? Said the pediatrician. To which my mom replied with the car doctor. Okay. I'm going to call the hospital right away and have an emergency call in. The same day in the evening I didn't know myself whether I was still alive or not. I was completely naked in my underpants. My parents felt the heat up to them. The nurse said that I am very sick and that they should leave me without any medication. It will have to wait how he will be tomorrow. But now Frankie is really sick. An elderly person would not survive this. Fortunately, you went to the pediatrician and immediately came here, ma'am. The nurse didn't say how much fever I had. The next day my mom heard through the nurse that I had a fever of 42 degrees. I stood with one leg in the dig and the other on the ground. I was very lucky that disaster did not strike.